ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for coming out to listen and participate in this forum, which you will find in years to come to have been one of the best few hours you would have spent in your life. As you have heard, the Caribbean is grappling with the issue of how do they treat with this plant that has been with us for some time. So what I want to do today is give you a feel for how I came to be involved in this. As you hear, I'm a scientist, and the positions that you need, the issues that you need to consider. So as the topic says, some of the options, considerations, prospects, and some of the lessons learned from decriminalization. So the historical background to decriminalization, you've just heard. I do have slides on it, so I'll skip them. If you see me skipping slides, don't worry about it. The presentation will be available. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I came to this, because I think it's important that you understand the perspective. So let me say up front, I'm not an advocate for anything. I'm not an advocate specifically for legalization or otherwise. I do believe, as Dr. Laws has said, and as the CARICOM report has concluded, that the criminalization of the use of marijuana has been very counterproductive and has created untold damage to our people over many, many years. But I'm not an advocate per se of legalization, although as you shall see, there are many benefits to be had from decriminalization and how we treat with it. I will look at some of the uses of cannabis. Dr. Laws has gone into it, but I want to tie that specifically because we find that a lot of the people talking about it actually don't really understand what they're talking about, including people in the industry. And then look at some of the prospects for it, and the key thing will be the Jamaican experience. Now, I could speak for hours on the Jamaican experience, but I won't. I'll give you an overview and try to answer any questions which you may have. So you heard some of the information on the historical background. You heard cannabis was brought largely to the islands in which we had a large Indo-Caribbean population, but it moved throughout the entire region pretty quickly. And for much of our history from the time these islands were populated, and certainly since the Indians came up until the early 1900s, cannabis was completely legal and able to be used. The criminalization started with a series of acts that Dr. Laws mentioned, starting first in Jamaica, moving then to Trinidad and throughout the region, particularly after Britain decided to reclassify the drug as a dangerous drug. And I have some of the data, the background on the slides. A pivotal occurrence, though, was when the United States passed this Marijuana Tax Act, and we don't have time to go into what was really behind that. But if you talk to people who have spent a lot of time looking at this was a time when alcohol was transitioning and several other items, tobacco, and so it is felt by some that they needed a new culprit, and cannabis became that item that prior to then was not, there was no criminal sanction for its use. Also, a lot of this was happening at the time when Caribbean people were began in the 30s, began vociferously asserting their rights for self-determination, for freedom, for change. And if you can imagine, you are in charge of these countries, and the majority of the population are starting to become very active. In some cases, in my own country, we have a long and violent history of opposition to injustice. So when the Rastafarians, the start of the Rastafarian movement and the following of Marcus Garvey's teaching and Marcus Garvey's own followings, and all of this became tied up with cannabis. it was a perfect opportunity for the then colonial masters to make sure that they tried to squash this. So in essence then, the process of criminalization and prohibition has been driven by many socio and geopolitical considerations, more so than by science, right? This was exacerbated, as I just indicated, by the concerns about persons beginning to agitate for political and other kinds of participation in a world at the time where this didn't exist, right? So this is sort of the background and the context. So I want to give you a snapshot of where we are today. And this is really difficult because I get information every day. And honestly, I can't keep up. So where are we today? So the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, just to give you a background, really set an international benchmark for cannabis and classified at the most recent update, it still remains classified as a Schedule 1 and Schedule 4 drug. In other words, to summarize, they say it's a drug or an item, a plant, that is at high risk of abuse, produces ill effects, and is of no therapeutic value. Dr. Laws spoke about that on the CARICOM. However, the ground has been changing and changing rapidly. So much so, as Dr. Laws said, that these conventions are really now completely outdated. So there are many countries in Europe, Central and South America, Africa, and the Caribbean have moved to decriminalize, and some have legalized. So much so that the WHO, the UN body, and the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs has formally requested a review of the status of cannabis. This will lead to potentially the first new guidance on cannabis, on marijuana, ganja, since 1935. That is how long it has not been seriously looked at. Uruguay was the first country to legalize cannabis for recreational use. They have certain restrictions. You must register, and it has to be, you have to be over 18 years old. And the age, as the doctors will tell you, is a very sensitive issue. Personally, I think 18 is a little young, but that's a challenge we have. It's the age of majority, so so that's the age we've chosen. Jamaica decriminalized in April 2015, and the first medical marijuana licenses were issued in 2017. We'll talk about that process. Mexico has decriminalized for 5 grams, Belize for up to 10 grams. Lesotho became the first African country to decriminalize in 2017, and Zimbabwe has decriminalized this year for medicinal and research purposes. In the US, 31 states and the District of Columbia have decriminalized for medical use. 9 have legalized cannabis for recreational use. There are certain restrictions where it's legalized. You require prescription or authorization or medical recommendation, along with other means of making sure that that its use is relatively controlled. I can tell you, having spoken to many persons from these states, what is written and what is practiced don't always accord with each other, let me put it that way, which is one of the challenges that we have to bear in mind as we enter this discussion. Canada is the first G7 country to legalize, will become the first G7 country to legalize for recreational use. Now, many persons don't know that medical cannabis was available for treatment in Canada from 2001. It's being spoken as if it's a recent phenomenon. It has been available for use for prescription purposes from 2001 and will become available for use recreationally in 2017, in 2018, 17th of October. So this is next week. And I can tell you the world is, if you're in the cannabis world, people are just going crazy right now. They have decided to go with a similar system of licensing as we have in Jamaica, except they've issued 6 licenses for cultivation, processing, analytical or testing, sale, research, and they have what they call a cannabis drug license. The other countries that have moved include the list shown there, very extensive list of countries. Have implemented medical cannabis legislation in Europe, while others such as Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, and Portugal allow use. So they haven't done the legal changes, but they allow the use. And this is today's news. As of next month, doctors in Northern Ireland will be able to prescribe cannabis products to patients in keeping with what is already the case in the UK, in England and Wales. And as of the 17th, as I told you, not only will cannabis be available for recreational use, you will be able to fly with up to 30 grams of marijuana in your luggage. Now, if you think what that is going to do to the security at the airport, I don't even want to think about it. This is how fast things are changing. Things are changing very, very rapidly. And it was with this kind of rapidity 3 years ago that I came to be involved with cannabis. I need to say I didn't have much experience with it before. I studied in Canada, and as we were discussing with Mr. Wilkin before we started, all of the students that I interacted with were regular users, and they were sure, because I came from Jamaica, yeah man, I must smoke ganja every day. I told him no, I never had it. And they could not believe it. That is how widespread the use is in Canada amongst adolescents. So they have some major issues. So let me give a little bit of a background. Jamaica had just decriminalized marijuana, ganja, in April 2015. I was actually in Trinidad when I got a call from Minister Anthony Hilton at the time, late at night, about 8:30, as he was wont to do. And he said the government wanted somebody to help them create an industry, because they passed the law with no idea as to what was going to happen afterwards. So they wanted somebody that had a strong scientific background, who could understand the technical issues, understand issues with trade and exporting sensitive products into the international market, understand the sensitive socio-economic and socio-political issues in trying to right what has been a historic wrong, and had a track record basically of creating things where there is nothing. So there's nobody to guide you. And so he asked me if I would do it. And I said, Minister, I'm not sure. There are lots of issues with marijuana. It's illegal, it's dangerous, people threaten you, there are drug dealers. I'm not sure I want to do it. And basically what he did is he went through my achievements, which I don't pay much attention to, particularly the work with getting things into market, setting up structures, understanding science, and said, you can't tell me no. Well, my wife happens to be Kittian. Her name is Diane Gordon. She was Philip, yes. So I am a resident, in fact a national, of St. Kitts and Nevis, just so that you know. And if you know Kittian women, you don't make those decisions without calling them. So I called her from Trinidad, and she asked me if I was crazy. After a long discussion, I said, look, here is what is going to happen. If I don't do it, it's not going to happen, and we are going to have to live with the consequences. So I agreed. And that is how I came to be involved with this, just so that you know. Right? Now, that gave me a particular perspective, and I will describe how this came to influence how the industry was set up and what has happened since. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the prospects. And I don't know your background, So I'm not going to presume what you know and don't know. I know some of you are doctors. When we talk a lot about cannabis, people, and even before I became involved, I was not aware that what really happens is that this plant, as do many others, has natural constituents that mimic other natural chemicals that we have in the body. And so when we think about the prospects and possibilities for medical cannabis, we need to understand what it does and how it works. So we have within our body a system that's called the endocannabinoid system, which plays an important role in influencing the function of our central and peripheral nervous system, how our nerves work. This system helps to regulate our physiological activities, several physiological activities, and also plays an important role in learning, cognitive activities. So things like memory and learning, when we do physical exercise, what kind of appetite we have, how we deal with pain, even to fertility, pregnancy, and pre- and postnatal development, among others, are influenced in some way or other by this system. This system is run through natural endocannabinoids. This is what they do. On the other hand, this same system mediates the impact of the main pharmacological effect of cannabis. In cannabis, there are cannabinoids which are derived from plants. These are called phytocannabinoids, and they mimic the impact of the cannabinoids that are naturally present in our body. And so the two main ones that you hear a lot about are the one that produces that euphoric feeling, the feel-good, tetrahydrocannabinol, and which also, and then the other one, CBD, cannabidiol, which influences appetite, pain management, and a range of others, some of which Dr. Laws went into. However, there are many others in other natural chemicals in the plant that have not been well studied. And so most of the focus now tends to be on these. And this may be where a lot of opportunities exist. Because when you take cannabidiol out of CBD, out of a plant, and you just use it as it is now, it could come from anywhere. It doesn't really matter. You can synthesize it, you can make it artificially, right? So these are located like this. There are two main classes, there are others, of compounds within cannabis. The cannabinoids, which has the ones we talk about, and the terpenes. The cannabinoids have all the effects that we talk about. The terpene, and they include, these are just some. In fact, people who test will tell you that there are 17 major cannabinoids that they test for, right? Even though we talk mainly just about 2 of them. So Dr. Laws mentioned cannabinol, and we talk about cannabidiol and delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. Those are the ones we talk about, but there are many others. The most heavily researched one of these, besides the THC, is CBD. And since Dr. Laws has already gone into what it does, I won't mention that in detail. However, cannabinol, which we don't talk about a lot, which is present more so in the aged plant, it's not normally naturally present, also has significant therapeutic benefits. For example, it is known to be synergistic and help with the sedative effects of THC and CBD with insomnia and other related illnesses, pain, anti-inflammatory illnesses such as Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and a range of others, and it also has anticonvulsive properties. I mention this because we hardly talk about CBN. Of course, Dr. Laws mentioned it, and I must tell you, in all the time that I've been attending cannabis events, and they don't talk about CBN. And I find it strange. And there are others. So the point is, if we are looking at this from a different perspective, then we need to look at it from a different perspective and consider all that there is. So I gave you that background because when we came to set up the industry in Jamaica, quite frankly, none of this was heavily considered. So St. Kitts and Nevis is coming to this at a time when the world has completely changed. So you have the opportunity to benefit from all of the knowledge that has been generated and to really consider in fundamental ways what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and what should work for you and what won't. So in setting up the industry, I'm going to give you some timelines and then run through some of the details. I mightn't dwell on some of the slides because it's a lot of information and I cut them a lot. So this is the timeline, just so that you understand. Up until 2015, Uruguay was the other company that had, other country that had moved to decriminalize. But they had not yet passed their regulations. I don't think their regulations came into being until late 2017, if memory serves me correct. So the act, the Dangerous Drug Amendment Act, was gazetted in April 2015, and the CLA board was appointed at the end of May. We had our first meeting June 1, and contracted consultants to give us some indication as to what the options were. The report was received in September, and the process of promulgating the regulations started in October 2015. Drafting, I gave instructions for drafting in November, and by January, and final instructions for drafting in January. So we worked through Christmas 2015. And the regulations, including all the license, the category of license, were ready in February 2016. So this is less than, I think this was about 9 months, which was the target I had given them. Unfortunately, the first license were not issued until the 18th of October 2017. And this is one of the lessons that I hope other Caribbean jurisdictions learn. There was a change of government, and one of the things that mature countries do is to continue to benefit from the good things that were being done before. What happened is that it took the new CLA, they changed key members of the commission, and it took them a year to sort of find out where they were going. And it took them another 6 months after that year to be able to issue licenses that were ready the day they came into office. Of course, I remained silent during that period because, you know, new commissioners need to understand. I offered to meet with the minister, the CLA, multiple times. And then I started saying, well, you know, maybe they think I'm looking at jobs, so let me forget it. And so I mentioned this because I would hate to see it happen anywhere else. So in setting up an institution that doesn't exist, it is my firm belief that nothing works, and a guiding principle in life is that you must have principles that determine how you operate. Now, these slides may be a little small, but I'll try to paraphrase them. I know some of you, like me, may not be able to read. But the main purpose of the CLA was to foster the growth and development and orderly regulation of a marijuana and hemp industry. This is a ganja, legal marijuana and hemp industry in Jamaica, including the use of the plant for medicinal, therapeutic, and scientific purposes. This had to be done done consistent with our obligations under international treaty for cultivation, production, use, and export. And so the Dangerous Drug Amendment Act gave this body the power to issue licenses, permits, and authorizations as may be appropriate for hemp and marijuana. The CLA, and this is important as you consider how you set up, did not have jurisdiction over the religious or sacramental use of the plant, nor, and this is important as well, did it have jurisdiction over the therapeutic items that did not contain more than 1% THC. What this meant is that any therapeutic item that just had like CBD that we spoke about earlier did not fall under the jurisdiction of this authority that was supposed to regulate the industry. And that has caused some problems. So amongst the guiding principles is to make sure we know what we're talking about, which wasn't clear apparently when the law was drafted, hence the fact that we had some issues. One of the principles is that the CLA would recognize and seek to protect the rights of those persons who had been long-standing advocates for and pioneers in the development of legal marijuana and hemp, including the small farmers. This was our first principle, that they must be recognized and protected. We also indicated that we recognize, and the industry must be developed, recognizing the unique contribution and cultural and historical legacy of Rastafarians to the development of the industry, and work closely with their representatives to protect their cultural identity as the industry develops and grows, and their rights. This must be an absolute imperative in the development of the industry. We also focused on indigenous cultivars and strains. This was one of our objectives as well. Critically, the CLA said, and the CLA was structured to provide funding, listen to this, to provide funding from the industry in support of the National Council on Drug Abuse. The CLA very strongly advocated and acknowledged the well-known and scientifically established potentially negative effects of the drug on physical and mental health, and therefore supported the National Council on Drug Abuse and responsible messaging, as with any other item. And there was, as you have in your commission, a representative of the National Council on Drug Abuse on the CLA's board, as were representatives of the Rastafarian communities, the farmers, and the ministries involved. So we started by laying out these principles, laid them out to my board, got them to agree, and hopefully abide by them. The main job we had was to set up the regulations, and what we proposed was a two-tier system, because to be honest with you, we were under a lot of pressure to get it done. Like yesterday, people said they had been waiting forever. So we proposed two systems where we would issue interim regulations, give them an opportunity to run and assess how they worked, so that we'd be in a position to make an amendment and come out with comprehensive regulations a little bit later on in the year. The interim regulations remain in effect to this day. The comprehensive regulations have not yet come into being. What we developed was a system of licenses. And this is also important how you structure. Cultivator licenses broken down by acreage, because you have to protect the small farmers that grow on small acreages. Licenses for transportation, because under the International Convention, any controlled substance that is grown or harvested must immediately become the property of the state. The state has to take ownership and manage the movement of those items. So we recognize that for the industry to exist, if you grow it and you can't transport it, because it's illegal to transport it, you wouldn't be able to move the drug around. So transportation licenses came into being. Retail licenses from dispensaries or farmers, what we originally called tea houses, which became herb houses, which are similar to what exists in the Netherlands, were another category of licenses, and therapeutic licenses. And then for manufacturing, and research and development, 2 categories, experimental for studies, and then analytical, just for laboratory services. And then import and export licenses, those were the categories. The export licenses were never promulgated, and we can talk about that. We had a process, a detailed process for handling the applications. I'm just putting it up there so that you understand that we worked out in detail, looking at the experiences of Colorado, Washington, all the states that had major issues. We were determined not to make those mistakes, and so we set these things in train. I want to move now quickly to the lessons learned. And there are other details that I can share with you during the question and answer. So having set all of this up, we realized that the Act did not address several critical issues that would be required. So the whole issue, well, let me go through the slide. So we needed some additional information. The issue of security and how this would be managed is critical. It was not addressed. What we proposed was a system that was similar to how it operated in Colorado, but was practical within our realities. So a 24-hour multi-layered security system was developed, and I have to tell you, there are only 2 people on that 15-member board that knew what this system was: the person responsible for security and myself. And the reason for that was not everybody that sat on that board, how do I put this? I wouldn't sleep comfortably at night knowing that everybody that sat on that board knew exactly what we were planning to do to ensure the security of the industry. I'm just telling you as it is. And that is also a reality that you have to bear in mind as you structure this. As you know, Jamaica is a major exporter, right? One of the major exporters of ganja. And so there's a lot of incentive for people to make money doing various things. You will require, if you have this industry, specially trained inspectors and staff with forensic investigative capabilities. We propose that they should be able to do inspections anywhere at any time, have adequate resources, and be suitably located. These were non-negotiable requirements to set the industry up. None of this is yet in place. The industry is up and running. We looked at issue of supply, and this is important. I saw some conclusions, findings in the CARICOM report. I'll just show you a few snapshots of it. I'm not sure the basis on which some of these decisions were arrived at, but we looked at what the supply was, and domestic demand was only 10% of our production, which means the other 90% was finding its way out of the country. And the domestic demand included all the tourists and other people that came in for it. So to summarize, what we saw, and I recommend or commend to you, a lot of countries talk about transition from illicit to licit, illegal to a legal industry. I think the data show that this has not happened in the US, where the black market remains very active in many of the states, including in Canada. We did not, with 90% of the production going out of the country, it's not practical to expect that most of it would transition to the legal market unless the economic incentive were so significant. And in fact, it was. Because, to cut a long story short, the price that the farmers were getting from the illegal industry, as with all value chains, was relatively low compared. In fact, it was 10 times lower than what they would get if they sold into the legal sector, if it were properly set up. So we were looking, without exports, at an additional perhaps 20 million US dollar multiplier impact on the economy, which has not yet materialized. So, some other things that needed to be thought about, and you, as a country that is not a major grower, needs to think about what are you going to do about importation? How is this going to be done? How is this going to be controlled? Who is going to control it? So the CLA had, at the time, had an agreement with the Ministry of Health that was responsible for most of the therapeutic items to administer the medical permit system on their behalf in collaboration with them, so that there would be one single point at which the entire sector would interface with the regulators. That has not happened. The CLA also proposed, because we developed, again, a completely cashless system because of the challenges with money laundering and just criminality in general. What was proposed was a completely cashless system, and there are many options for that today which didn't even exist in 2016, 2017. So other decisions which you need to think about. Sacramental rights. How will this be treated? You do not yet have an act, I don't think. This is an early stage. This is something that you need to think about. How will transportation be handled? Edibles, which have been prohibited in Canada with good reason, because you can't have edibles if the people don't know what they're putting into it. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, up until 2 weeks ago, I would tell you I hadn't heard of anybody dying from an overdose of any marijuana-derived drug. There was a student, I think at the University of the West Indies, that ate a couple of cookies not knowing that they were laced, I mean, beyond laced with marijuana, and expired because of the levels that, and this is somebody who had never used, right? So are we going to decriminalize? Are you going to legalize? Are you going to leave it as it is? These are some of the questions. If we look at where Jamaica is today, there are 22 licenses issued. And these 4 are retail, and the majority are for growing. There are a couple for transportation, and there are 4 legal dispensaries that are now open in the country. The export license has not yet been drafted, but as I indicated, there have been 2 sets of exports of products containing CBD. So whatever you read in the news, I can assure you that the CLA didn't know anything about it until even the minister with responsibility didn't know about at least one of the shipments until later on. I would hate to see this happen elsewhere. The Ministry of Health, Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Industry, Agriculture and Fisheries are all involved. The overlaps between them have not been clarified. So it's a zoo, is what it is, to be honest with you. Because you need to clarify who is going to do what, or there will be issues. The truth is we've managed it well, considering all of these conflicts. The analytical framework has not been developed. As I told you, security, infrastructure, enforcement, how we deal with financing. The industry cannot be banked at this time because of concerns about correspondent banking relationships. So none of the banks will touch you. I know people in the industry, some brethren who have sacramental sanctioned events, who have lost their bank accounts because they're holding an event that involves ganja. Now before, it's funny because they had the bank accounts for years. Before they got approval to hold these events, they had bank accounts. It's the same thing was happening. People were coming there, and partaking. This is Jamaica. People smoke relatively freely, even though it was illegal. The moment they got themselves legal, they lost their bank accounts. These are some of the issues that you need to grapple with. And then how do you support and grow the industry with the traditional and sacramental farmers? So quickly, some considerations for you, and then I'll close. St. Kitts has a unique opportunity, as do other Caribbean countries. In fact, even countries like St. Vincent, where I was with Minister Caesar yesterday, day before, I don't remember, and who have gone down the road, are going down the road on the basis of what went before and their conceptualization of what it should be. This is the first time I'm presenting this information. This information has never been shared in Jamaica. So the CLA doesn't know, the government doesn't know, right? You have an opportunity to really create something that works well for you, and not allow the benefit of any industry that is set up to be taken by others. In Jamaica, I fought hard to get put into our regulations that any license that is granted must go to an entity that is 51% locally owned. It got tremendous backlash. But because of that, investors have to find a local partner, and they have to cede control of that entity to a local partner. Otherwise, nobody local will participate in the industry. So I strongly recommend that you look at that kind of a framework, right? There are things that we have to consider. What about driving under the influence? This was mentioned. We need to think about that. If you're going to do that, then you need to be able to test for intoxication, right? How will growing, if you permit it, be controlled? What medical benefits will we look at? What about smoking? How is that going to be treated? Will we look at decriminalization versus legalization and the impact on society? What about hemp? How is that going to be treated? There is a danger if they're both cultivated in too close proximity because of cross-pollination. How will it be regulated? What will the structure of the national system look like? What about expungement of criminal records? How will this be treated? What are the criteria? How will we deal with the sale, if we allow it, to visitors or tourists that come in? How will we deal with exports? And what kind of infrastructure do we need? Now, I know you can't see these, but I just put them up. These came out of the CARICOM report. And the reason I put them up is because when I read them, I'm a scientist. When I read the report, and then I looked at the data that were referenced in the report, there was an incongruence. Where this statement was saying that there was decline and increase and so on, when I looked at the data, I wasn't seeing it. So I just mentioned that we need to be very clear that the decisions we take are based on fact, actual data that we can verify and validate. And not just anecdotal information, although that is important, right? What is without question is that a properly structured industry can have significantly greater benefits than the costs. And CARICOM did a range of studies that showed, I think only in one of the jurisdictions mentioned, where the costs to set up and regulate the industry exceeded the benefits. Right? All right. So how do you treat with this whole topic in the current dispensation? Well, everything has changed. We started with this. The world is rapidly going to either decriminalize or legalize or allow use. Right? There are potential roadblocks, but these are rapidly being cleared. In fact, the Drug Enforcement Authority in the US has recently moved a cannabis-derived drug to Schedule 5 from Schedule 1, admitting that there's no risk of addiction or money laundering associated with the item. So you are in a place to create for yourself your own vision of what this industry should look like. I will close by sharing with you what my vision was and what the CLA at the time was. So what we saw was multiple farmers operating with different varieties, supplying local therapeutic centers or tea houses, small farmers using best practices to grow a variety of indigenous cultivar, delivering their specific benefits that they have measured to their target market, with each farmer earning 5 to 10 times what they would have been getting were they in the illicit industry. The country would be renowned, world-renowned as a therapeutic center, offering cutting-edge therapies for a range of illnesses, supported by entire communities that develop community tourism experiences, including the tea houses and therapeutic centers. We're talking about integrated experiences, as you already have with your integrated tourism products, hiking, trails, physical activity, as well as medicinal treatments. The tea houses would offer different treatments so that they don't compete with each other. And in an island as small as St. Kitts is in terms of physical space, this is something you might want to think about. Zoning and the number that are licensed within a particular jurisdiction. And traditional breeders and practitioners would be valued for their traditional knowledge, which could be converted now to real value in terms of economic benefit for them and the country. This traditional knowledge would attract the world's leading research entities to Jamaica, and in fact, several of them are there. Canopy is there, and there are several of them there, but they're not tapping into the traditional knowledge. That's another story. And a range of international firms would set up across the country because they wanted to be close to where growing was taking place. And of course, we would produce a range of high-value treatments, nutraceuticals, pharmaceutical, and herbal products in the different categories from ganja, inclusive of hemp. Finally, we would also develop an industry where hemp products would be the output, branded and made in the country and sold in a manner to Sea Island cotton, which comes from the Caribbean, was grown extensively in Nevis, and where a Sea Island cotton shirt sells for about 700 pounds, one shirt. But we don't grow it in the Caribbean, hardly. And finally, the Rastafarian community as a whole, including individual members of the community, would have created the kind of wealth that the Indian communities in the US are doing by leveraging their brand into a range of products with intellectual property protection for which consumers pay a good price. So this, in a snapshot, was the vision. So I want to close by saying, ladies and gentlemen, your options, no, our options are limited only by our vision. We are in a race against time. And in this race, it doesn't matter where you're located or what your size is. So I share with you this African proverb. Every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows it must run faster than the fastest lion or it will be killed. Every morning a lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle or it will starve to death. It matters not whether you're a lion or a gazelle. When the sun comes up, you better hit the ground running. Thank you.
Stay up to date with news, programs, and activities of the government with SKNIS. Like us on Facebook. Listen to us on SoundCloud. Follow us on Twitter. And watch our videos on YouTube. Connect with us today. SKNIS, St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service.